All right, class, we're on chapter 11. And this chapter is titled, A Gigantic Vat of Incandesto. Flora put Ulysses down on her bed, and he looked even smaller sitting there than in the bright light overhead. So she snuck her squirrel, Ulysses, up to her room, and her mom didn't notice. He also looked pretty bald. Good grief, said Flora. The squirrel certainly didn't look heroic, but then neither did the nearsighted, unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper. Ulysses looked up at Flora, and then he looked down at his tail. He seemed relieved to see it. He lowered his nose and sniffed along the length of it. I was hoping you could understand me, said Flora. The squirrel raised his head. He stared at her. Wow, said Flora. Great. Okay, I can't understand you, and that's a small problem. But we'll figure out a way to communicate, okay? Nod at me if you understand what I'm saying. Like this. Flora nodded, and Ulysses nodded back. Flora's heart leapt high in her chest. I'm going to try to explain what happened to you, okay? Ulysses nodded his head very fast. And again, Flora's heart leapt high inside of her, in a hopeful and extremely uncynical kind of way. She closed her eyes. Don't hope, she said. Do not hope. Instead, observe. Do not hope, instead observe was a piece of advice that appeared in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. According to Terrible Things, hope sometimes got in the way of action. For instance, if you looked at your elderly Aunt Edith choking on a piece of steak from an all-you-can-eat buffet and you told yourself, man, I sure hope she's not choking, you would waste several valuable, life-saving Heimlich maneuver-performing seconds. Do not hope, instead observe, were words that Flora, as a cynic, had found quite useful in the extreme. She repeated them to herself a lot. Okay, said Flora. She opened her eyes. She looked at the squirrel. What happened to you is that you got vacuumed. And because you got vacuumed, you have powers. Ulysses gave her a questioning look. Do you know what a superhero is? The squirrel continued to stare at her. Right, said Flora. Of course you don't. A superhero is someone with special powers. And he uses those powers to fight the forces of darkness and evil, like Alfred T. Slipper, who's also Incandesto. Ulysses blinked several times in a nervous kind of way. Look, said Flora, and she grabbed the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto off her desk. She pointed at Alfred in his janitor uniform. See? This is Alfred, and he is an unassuming, nearsighted, stuttering janitor who works cleaning the multi-floor offices of Paxatucket Life Insurance Company. He lives a quiet life in a studio apartment with his parakeet Dolores for company. Ulysses looked down at the picture of Alfred, and then back up at Flora. Okay, said Flora, so, one day, Alfred takes a tour of the Incandesto cleaning factory, and he slips Alfred T. Slipper, get it, into a gigantic vat of Incandesto, and it changes him. And so now, when there's a great crisis, when malfeasance is apparent, that means bad deeds, like evil. When malfeasance is apparent, Alfred turns himself into... Flora flipped through the pages of the comic and stopped at the panel that showed the glowing, powerful Incandesto. Incandesto, she said. See? Alfred T. Slipper becomes a righteous pillar of light, so bright that the most heinous villain trembles before him and confesses. Flora realized that she was shouting the tiniest bit. She looked down at Ulysses. His eyes were enormous in his small face. Flora tried to sound calm, reasonable. She lowered her voice. As Incandesto, she said, Alfred sheds light into the darkest corners of the universe. He can fly. Also, he visits the elderly. And that's what a superhero is. And I think you might be one too. At least, I think you have powers. So far, all we know about you is that you're really strong. Ulysses nodded and puffed out his chest. Flora, her mother shouted. "Get down here. Dinner is ready." "What else can you do?" said Flora to the squirrel. "If you're truly a superhero, how will you fight evil?" Ulysses furrowed his brow. Flora bent down. She put her face close to his. "Think about it," she said. "Imagine what you might be able to do." "Florabelle," her mother shouted, "I can hear you talking to yourself. You shouldn't talk to yourself. People will hear you and think you're strange." "I'm not talking to myself," Flora shouted. "Well then, with whom are you speaking?" "A squirrel." There was a long silence from down below. And then her mother said, "That's not funny, Florabelle. Get down here right now." All right, that's the end of that chapter. But there is a little picture. This is Flora looking at her comic book with Ulysses. And there's the picture of that hero she likes. Oh, hang on, let me tap it. There's the picture of the hero she likes, Incandesto. There he is. Chapter 12, The Forces of Evil. When Flora came back upstairs after dinner, she found Ulysses curled up in a tight little ball, sleeping on her pillow. She put her hand out and touched his forehead with one finger. His eyes twitched, but they didn't open. She picked up the pillow and moved it carefully to the foot of the bed. She changed into her pajamas, lay down, and imagined the words. A superhero squirrel rested at her feet, and so she was not lonely at all, emblazoned on the ceiling above her. "That's exactly right," she said. Before the divorce, before her father moved out of the house and into an apartment, he had often sat beside her at night and read aloud from the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto. It was his favorite comic. It always cheered him up to read Alfred T. Slipper and Dolores. Her father did an excellent parakeet imitation. "Holy bagamba," he would say in the voice of Dolores. "Wholly anticipated occurrences." Wholly and unanticipated occurrences was what Dolores would say when something truly unexpected and unbelievable was happening, which was basically all the time. Life was pretty exciting when you were Incandesto's parakeet. Flora sat up and looked down at a sleeping squirrel. "Wholly and unanticipated occurrences," Flora said. It sounded better when her father said it. Not that he said it these days. He didn't say much of anything anymore. Her father had always been kind of a sad, quiet man, but since the divorce, he had been even sadder, even quieter, which was fine with Flora, really. Cynics don't like a lot of chatter. Do you think she really doesn't care? I am skeptical. Besides, Alfred T. Slipper was a quiet man too. For instance, when he was on his tour of the Incandesto facility and had fallen into a vat of Incandesto, he hadn't even said a single word. Not even oops. Words had appeared above his head, however, and Flora's father had read those words with her so many times she could recite them by heart. "He is an unassuming janitor, but he will dare to battle the darkness of the universe. Do you doubt him? Do not. Alfred T. Slipper will live to fight the forces of evil. He will become known to the world as Incandesto." Flora lay back down. If the squirrel were in a comic, she thought, what words would have appeared in the space over his head when he was sucked into that vacuum cleaner? "He is an unassuming squirrel." Yep. "But he will soon conquer the villains of all stripes. He will defend the defenseless and protect the weak." That sounds good too. "He will become known to the world as Ulysses." Holy bagumba. Anything could happen. Together, she and Ulysses would change the world. Or something. "Do not hope. Instead observe," Flora whispered to calm herself down. "Just observe the squirrel." And then she fell asleep. Chapter 13, The Typewriter. He woke in darkness. His heart was beating very fast. Something had happened. What was it? He couldn't think. He was too hungry to think. He sat up and looked around the room. He was in bed. and Flora's feet were in his face. She was snoring. He could see the outline of her round head. He loved that head. But man, was he hungry. The door to the bedroom was open. Ulysses got off the pillow and went out of the room. He crept along the dark hallway. He went down the stairs and past the little shepherdess. The house was dark, but there was a light on in the kitchen. The kitchen! This was exactly where he needed to be. He put his nose up. He sniffed. He smelled something cheesy. Wonderful. He ran through the living room and dining room and into the kitchen. He climbed up on the counter, and there it was, a lone cheese puff, perched on the edge of the red Formica countertop. He ate it, and it was delicious. Maybe there were more cheese puffs. He opened a cabinet, and yes, there was a big bag with the beautiful word Cheeseomania written in golden script in front of it. He ate until the bag was empty. Then he burped softly, gratefully. He looked around the kitchen. So, there is Ulysses, and he sees something. And it looks like he's playing now with Flora's mother's typewriter. Try to get it to not be blurry. There we go. So you see now up here. Oh, there we go. Up here. Looks like a letter. So he's typed something. He's typed a couple of things. In a darkened kitchen. And this is where they kind of make like it's a graphic novel or a comic book, and they add like the dramatic text down here that you might find in a comic book. In a darkened kitchen, the unassuming squirrel worked slowly. His whiskers trembled. His heart sang. Was he fighting evil? Who could say? So he typed S and Q. Chapter 14. Squirtle. Flora Buckman, get down here right now. Don't call me Flora, Flora muttered. She opened her eyes. The room was bright with sunlight. She had been dreaming something wonderful. What was it? She had been dreaming about a squirrel. In her dream, he was flying with his legs straight out in front of him and his tail straight out behind him. He was a squirrel on the way to something. He looked supremely, magnificently heroic. Flora sat up and looked down at her feet. There was Ulysses, sleeping on the pillow. He did look heroic. In fact, he was glowing, just like Incandesto, except oranger? He was extremely orange. So is that a glow? What the heck? Said Flora. She leaned over Ulysses and reached out a finger to touch his ear. She held the finger up to the light. Cheese. He was covered in cheese dust. Uh-oh, said Flora. Flora! Her mother shouted. I'm not kidding. Get down here right now. Flora went down the stairs and past Mary Ann, whose cheeks were glowing a healthy and disgusting pink. So you remember that was the lamp. You dumb lamp, said Flora. Now! Shouted Flora's mother, and Flora broke into a trot. She found her mother standing in the kitchen in her bathrobe, staring at the typewriter. What's this? Her mother said. She pointed at the typewriter. It's a typewriter, said Flora. She knew her mother was absent-minded, but this was ridiculous. How could she not recognize her own typewriter? I know it's my typewriter, said her mother. I'm talking about the piece of paper in it. I'm talking about the words on the paper. Flora leaned forward. She squinted. She tried to make sense of the word typed on the top of the page. Squirtle. Squirtle? Said Flora out loud. She felt a surge of delight at the zippy idiocy of the word. It was almost as good a word as tootie. Keep reading, said her mother. Squirtle, said Flora again. I am Ulysses, born anew? Do you think that's funny? Said her mother. Not really, said Flora. Her heart was beating very fast in her chest, and she felt dizzy. I have told you and told you to leave this typewriter alone, said her mother. I didn't, said Flora. What goes on here is serious business, said her mother. I am a professional writer. I am under a deadline for this novel. There is no time for hijinks. Plus, you ate a whole bag of cheese puffs? I did not, said Flora. Her mother pointed at an empty Cheesemania bag on the counter, and then she pointed at the typewriter. Flora's mother liked to point at things. You left cheese dust all over my typewriter. That's disrespectful, and you simply cannot eat a whole bag of cheese puffs. It's not healthy. I didn't, said Flora, but then another wave of dizziness came over her. The squirrel could type. Wholly unanticipated occurrences. I'm sorry, said Flora in a small voice. Well, said her mother. She raised a finger. She was obviously getting ready to point at something again. Fortunately, the doorbell rang. Chapter 15. The Electric Chair. To say that the Buckman doorbell rang would be inaccurate. Something had happened to the bell. Its inner workings had become twisted, warped, confused, so that instead of emitting a pleasant ding or bong, the doorbell now sent an angry, window-shattering, you guessed the wrong answer on a game show kind of buzz through the Buckman house. Eh. To Flora, the doorbell sounded like the electric chair. Not that she had ever heard of an electric chair, but she had read about electric chairs and terrible things can happen to you. That particular installment of the comic had not contained any other advice other than that it would be best to avoid getting to a place in your life where you might have to face the electric chair. Flora had found it to be a threatening and not at all useful episode of terrible things. Oh, that's your father, said Flora's mother. He rings that doorbell to make me feel guilty. The doorbell buzzed and crackled again. See? Her mother said. Flora didn't see. How could one person ringing a doorbell make another person feel guilty? It was ridiculous. But then just about everything that Flora's mother said or wrote sounded ridiculous to Flora. For example, on feathered wings of joy. Since when did joy have feathered wings? Well, don't just stand there, Florabelle. Go open the door. Let him in. The electric chair knell of the doorbell sounded through the house again. For the love of Pete, said her mother. What's he doing, leaning on that thing? Go let him in, will you? Flora walked slowly through the dining room and into the living room. She shook her head in amazement. Upstairs in her room, there was a squirrel who could type. Holy bagumba, thought Flora. Things are going to change around here. We're going to be vanquishing villains left and right. She smiled a very large smile. The doorbell gave another outraged sizzle. Flora was still smiling when she unlocked the door and opened it wide. Chapter 16. Victims of Extended Hallucinations. It was not her father at the door. It was Tootie. Tootie Tickum, said Flora. Tootie stepped through the door and into the living room, and then she stopped. Her eyes widened. What in the world? She said. Flora didn't even bother turning around. She knew what Tootie was looking at. That's the little shepherdess, said Flora. The guardian of lost sheep or something. She belongs to my mother. Right, said Tootie, and she shook her head. Well, never mind about the lamp. She took another step closer to Flora. Where's the squirrel? She whispered. Upstairs, Flora said. I've come and checked to see if what I think happened yesterday actually happened, or if I'm the victim of an extended hallucination. Flora looked Tootie in the eye. She said, Ulysses can type. Who can type? The squirrel. He's a superhero. Tootie said, For heaven's sake, what kind of superhero types? It was a good and also slightly disturbing point. How exactly was a typing squirrel going to fight villains and change the world? "George!" shouted Flora's mother. "It's not Pop," Flora shouted back. "It's Mrs. Tickum." There was a silence from the kitchen, and then Flora's mother came into the living room with a big, fake, adult smile plastered on her face. "Mrs. Tickum," she said, "what a lovely surprise. What can we do for you?" Have you ever been in a situation where you can tell that adults are, like, just smiling to be, like, extra polite? Sometimes adults feel like they have to do that. "Who?" "Flora," said Tootie. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Tootie smiled a big, fake adult smile back. "Oh," she said, "I just came to pay Flora a visit." "Who?" "Flora," said Tootie, "your daughter." "Really?" said Flora's mother. "You came to see Flora?" "I'll be right back," said Flora. She ran out of the living room and through the dining room. "What a truly extraordinary lamp," she heard Tootie say. "Oh, do you like it?" said Flora's mother. "Ha," thought Flora. And then she was out of the dining room and into the kitchen. She ripped the paper out of the typewriter and looked down at the words. They were absolutely not a hallucination, meaning that she hadn't imagined it. "Holy bagumba," said Flora. A loud scream suddenly echoed through the house. Flora took the paper and shoved it down in front of her pajamas and ran to the living room. Ulysses was sitting on top of Marianne. Or rather, he was trying to sit on top of Marianne. His feet were scrabbling to gain purchase on the little shepherdess's pink-flowered head lampshade. He paused in his efforts and looked at Flora in an apologetic and hopeful way, and then he returned to wobbling back and forth. "Oh, my goodness," said Tootie. "How did it get in here?" said Flora's mother. "It just came flying down the stairs." "Yes," said Tootie. She gave Flora a meaningful look. "Flying!" "Well, it absolutely scared the living daylights out of me and Mrs. Tickum. We screamed." "We did," said Tootie. "We screamed. There's just no end to the excitement." "If that squirrel breaks my lamp, I don't know what I'll do. Marianne is very precious to me." "Marianne," said Tootie. "I'll just get him off the lamp, okay?" said Flora. She put out a hand. "Don't touch it!" screamed her mother. "It has a disease." So, good picture here. So there's the lamp. And there's Ulysses, trying to hang on. Kind of wobbling around. The doorbell, as if it were echoing Flora's mother's advice, buzzed a terrible warning buzz. Flora and her mother and Tootie all turned. A small voice called out. The voice said, "Great Aunt Tootie?" So it's still not Flora's dad at the door. It sounds like it's a new character. So we'll find out who it is next time.